The rain had not stopped since morning, and Alira Hartwell stood at the edge of the old stone tower, with a folded letter pressed against her chest. Her shoes were soaked. Her hands were shaking, though not from the cold. Behind her, back at the house, the last of the funeral guests were leaving, their cars crawling slowly down the muddy lane. She had slipped away from all of it, from the soft voices and the careful hugs, because she could not stand one more person telling her that her mother was in a better place now. She needed somewhere to put the weight sitting in her chest. And for reasons she could not fully explain, her feet had carried her here, to the tower that had stood sealed and silent on the far edge of the Hartwell land for as long as she could remember. It was a strange structure, tall and round, built from gray stone that had darkened with age. No door could be seen from the outside. The narrow windows near the top were boarded from within, not from without, which had always struck Alira as odd, even as a child. Ivy climbed one side of it in thick ropes. Birds nested in the cracks near the roof. People in the small town of Ashford Hollow rarely spoke of it, and when they did, they lowered their voices, as if the tower itself might be listening. Alira had grown up hearing only fragments. Her grandmother used to say the tower was older than the house, older than the family's claim to the land. Her mother, Margaret, had once told her, in a rare, unguarded moment, that something sad had happened there long before either of them was born, and that the family had simply agreed, without ever really discussing it, to leave it alone. Nobody entered. Nobody asked questions. It was just there, the way a hill is there, or a river bend, something so old it had stopped being a mystery and had become part of the landscape instead. But grief has a way of making people do things that make no sense to anyone but themselves. Alira crouched at the base of the tower, where a narrow crack ran between two stones near the ground, wide enough to slip a folded piece of paper through if you were careful. She did not know why she had brought the letter. She had written it the night before, unable to sleep, sitting at her mother's kitchen table with a single lamp burning. She had written it the way some people write to a friend far away, or to a version of themselves they used to be. She had written about her mother's laugh, about the smell of her mother's bread on Sunday mornings, about how strange and unbearable it was that the world simply continued turning after someone you loved stopped breathing. She had not planned to send it anywhere. But sitting there with the paper in her hands, she found she could not throw it away, and she could not keep it either. It felt too heavy to carry alone. So she had walked here, through the rain, to the one place in Ashford Hollow that had always felt separate from everything else. A place outside of time, a place that kept its own secrets and asked nothing in return. She knelt at the crack in the stone and hesitated only a moment before pushing the folded letter through. It slid into the darkness and vanished from sight. "I don't know if anyone is in there," she whispered, feeling foolish even as she said it. "I don't even know why I'm doing this, but if you're there, whoever you are, or whatever is left of you, I just needed somewhere to put this." The wind picked up, rattling the ivy against the stones. Somewhere behind her, a car door slammed, and she heard her Uncle Victor calling her name across the field, his voice sharp with irritation even now, even on the day they had buried her mother. She stood, brushed the mud from her knees, and walked back toward the house without looking behind her. That night, lying in her childhood bedroom, with the rain still tapping the window, Alira thought about the letter more than she expected to. She told herself it did not matter. Paper left in a crack in an old wall would simply rot there, forgotten, the way so many things in Ashford Hollow seemed to be forgotten. And yet, there was something oddly comforting in the thought that her words were somewhere other than inside her own head, somewhere outside herself. Somewhere she did not have to carry them alone. The days that followed blurred together the way days do after a loss. There were papers to sign, a house to sort through, decisions to make about her mother's belongings that felt too large for someone only 26 years old to be making. Uncle Victor, her mother's older brother, made his opinions known loudly and often. He believed the family should sell the land, tower and all, to a development company that had been circling Ashford Hollow for years, eager to build vacation homes along the river. He called the tower an eyesore, a waste of good land, a relic that served no purpose except collecting dust and superstition. "It's not doing anyone any good standing there," he said one evening, standing in the kitchen with a glass of something amber in his hand. "Your mother could never bring herself to deal with it. Maybe you can be the one who finally does." Alira did not answer him directly. She only said she needed time before making any decisions about the land, which was true enough, though she did not tell him the real reason her mind kept drifting back to the tower. A week after the funeral, unable to sleep again, she found herself walking the same path through the field, the letter from that first night still fresh enough in her memory that she almost expected to find it lying untouched, exactly where she had left it, soaked through by rain, ruined and forgotten. Instead, when she knelt at the crack in the stone, her breath caught in her throat. The letter was gone. She pressed her fingers into the gap, feeling along the cold stone, but there was nothing there. Only empty space, and the faint smell of dust and old wood drifting up from somewhere deep inside. Her first thought was practical. Perhaps the wind had blown it further inside, or an animal had disturbed it, dragged it off to build a nest somewhere in the tower's hollow center. That made sense. That was logical. And yet, kneeling there in the dark with her heart beating strangely fast, logic did not feel like enough of an answer. She thought about the boarded windows near the top of the tower, boarded from the inside. She thought about how, as a child, she had once asked her mother why nobody ever tried to open the tower up, clean it out, turn it into something useful, and how her mother's face had gone very still and quiet before she changed the subject entirely. Alira did not write another letter that night. She only knelt there for a long while, staring at the dark gap in the stone, feeling the strange pull of a question she did not yet know how to ask. But 2 days later, she wrote again. This time it was not about grief exactly, though grief still sat underneath everything she wrote in those days. She told the tower, or whatever unseen ear might be listening, about her mother's garden, about how the tomatoes were coming in heavy and nobody was left to pick them. She wrote about small, ordinary things, the kind of things you only tell someone you trust completely, because they carry no weight to anyone except the person living inside the moment. She folded the letter and pushed it through the crack, the same as before. This became a pattern, though she would not have called it that at the time. Once a week, sometimes twice, she found her way to the tower with a folded page in hand. She told herself each time that this would be the last one, that she was being strange, that grief was making her do things a rational person would never do. And each time, within a few days, the letter would be gone when she returned. Nobody in the house knew about her visits. Uncle Victor was too busy arguing with lawyers and developers to notice where she walked in the evenings. The few neighbors who might have seen her crossing the field said nothing, the way people in small towns often say nothing about things they find slightly unsettling. It was Nora Pike, her closest friend since childhood, who finally noticed the change in her. They were sitting on the porch one evening, sharing a pot of tea that had gone lukewarm between them, when Nora set her cup down and studied Alira's face with the particular directness only an old friend can get away with. "You've been going out to the tower," Nora said. It was not a question. Alira nearly denied it out of instinct, the same instinct that made her keep the whole strange habit private in the first place. But something in Nora's steady gaze made the words dissolve before she could speak them. "How did you know?" "You get a certain look," Nora said, "like you're carrying something you haven't decided whether to put down or keep holding. And Danny Marsh mentioned he saw you out there a few evenings back, walking toward it right around dusk. He was curious. So was I." Alira felt her face warm, though she was not entirely sure why. Daniel Marsh had moved to Ashford Hollow the year before to teach at the small local school, and though she barely knew him, the thought of being seen doing something so private, so difficult to explain, made her stomach twist uncomfortably. "I've been writing letters," Alira admitted finally, the words feeling strange and small once spoken aloud, "and leaving them there, in the wall." Nora did not laugh, which Alira had half expected, and had half dreaded even more. "Why the tower?" Nora asked instead, gently. Alira thought about it for a long moment before answering. "Because it doesn't ask anything of me. It doesn't tell me it's going to be okay, or that time heals everything, or any of the things people feel like they have to say. It just listens, or it seems to anyway." "Do you think someone's actually in there?" The question hung between them in the cooling evening air. Alira thought of the crack in the stone, empty each time she returned. She thought of the boarded windows facing inward instead of outward, sealed by hands that must have belonged to someone, once. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but something is happening to those letters. They don't just disappear into nothing." Nora studied her for a long while, and then, Instead of dismissing the idea, she asked the one question that would end up changing everything that followed. Then maybe it's time you found out who's been reading them. That question settled into Alira in a way she did not expect. Over the following weeks, even as she continued sorting through her mother's belongings, even as Uncle Victor continued pressing about the land sale, even as the ordinary business of grief and daily life pulled at her from every direction, a small, persistent curiosity took root inside her. She began to notice details she had overlooked before. The way certain stones near the base of the tower looked slightly different in color, as though they had been moved and replaced at some point long ago. The way the ivy near the eastern side grew in an odd, deliberate pattern, almost as if something beneath it had been disturbed and regrown differently than the rest. She began asking careful questions around town, though she was cautious about how she phrased them, unwilling to become the subject of gossip the way her mother clearly had never wanted to be. She asked the town librarian, an elderly man named Walter Finch, whether any old records existed about the tower's construction. Walter's expression shifted the moment she asked, a flicker of something guarded crossing his face before he composed himself again. "That's an old question," he said carefully, "and an old story. Are you certain you want to go digging into it, Miss Hartwell? Some things in this town were buried a long time ago for good reason." His words did nothing to discourage her. If anything, they only confirmed what she had already begun to suspect. The tower was not simply an old, forgotten structure. It held something, or someone, that the town had chosen, deliberately and collectively, to forget. That night, Alira wrote her longest letter yet. She did not write about her mother this time, nor about the garden, nor about ordinary daily things. She wrote a single, simple question, folded the page carefully, and carried it out to the tower beneath a sky heavy with stars. She knelt at the familiar crack in the stone, her heart pounding harder than it ever had before, and pushed the letter through into the darkness. The question inside read simply, "Who are you?" She did not expect an answer. She told herself, walking back through the dark field toward the house, that she was only asking into empty air, the way people sometimes speak to the graves of those they have lost, knowing full well that no reply will ever come. But 3 days later, when she returned to the tower at dusk, something new waited for her at the base of the crack in the stone, something that had not been there before, and that no wind or animal could have placed so carefully, so deliberately, exactly where she would be certain to find it. A single pressed flower, dried and flattened with obvious care, rested on the small ledge of stone just beneath the crack. Alira stood completely still, staring down at it, the evening air suddenly feeling very thin around her. Somewhere behind those sealed stones, someone had read her question, and someone, after 10 years of silence the town had never fully explained, had chosen, quietly and without a single word, to answer. Alira did not tell anyone about the flower. Not Nora, not Daniel Marsh, not even in the quiet of her own thoughts did she try to explain it fully to herself. She simply carried it back to the house, wrapped carefully in a handkerchief, and placed it inside the pages of an old book on her nightstand, the way a person might press something precious before it has the chance to fade. For the first time since her mother's funeral, she found herself looking forward to something, not in a loud, obvious way, but in the quiet manner grief allows once it begins to soften at the edges. She began writing letters more often, sometimes twice a week, sometimes more. She wrote about the color of the sky at sunset, about a bird that had built a nest in the old oak near the porch, about small victories, like finally being able to sort through her mother's closet without breaking down in tears halfway through. She never asked directly who was behind the stone again. Something told her that pushing too hard, too fast, might frighten away whatever fragile connection had begun to form. Instead, she let the letters carry her curiosity gently, the way water carries a leaf downstream without forcing it anywhere. The responses, when they came, were never words. They were small, careful things. A smooth gray stone, worn perfectly round by years of river water. A single button, old and tarnished, the kind that might have belonged to a coat from decades past. Once, a tiny sprig of dried lavender, its scent faint but unmistakable, tied with a thread so thin it might have been pulled from an old piece of fabric. Each object felt like a sentence, in a language Alira was only beginning to learn. She could not always understand what they meant, but she understood, without question, that they meant something, that whoever left them was trying, in the only way available, to speak back. Word of her visits to the tower eventually spread, as things tend to do in a town as small as Ashford Hollow. Daniel Marsh, the young schoolteacher Nora had mentioned, found himself walking the same field path more than once, always at a respectful distance, never quite approaching, though Alira noticed him regardless. He had kind eyes and an easy, unhurried way of moving through the world that made him seem older than his years. When they finally spoke properly, it was not about the tower at all, but about a book he had borrowed from the school library that had once belonged to her mother. She used to volunteer reading afternoons for the younger children, Daniel explained, standing at the edge of the garden with the book held carefully in both hands. I only knew her a little, but the children adored her. I'm sorry for your loss. It was a simple, ordinary conversation, and yet something about his gentleness reminded her of the flower pressed inside her nightstand book, a small kindness offered without demand for anything in return. She found herself, in the weeks that followed, looking forward to these brief exchanges nearly as much as she looked forward to her visits to the tower. Still, the mystery of who lived behind those sealed stones pulled at her thoughts constantly. She returned to Walter Finch at the library, this time with a more specific question, one she hoped he could not so easily deflect. I know something happened here, she said, sitting across from him at the small reading table near the history section. Something involving the tower. I'm not asking to cause trouble, Mr. Finch. I only want to understand. Walter studied her for a long moment, his fingers tapping slowly against the worn wood of the table. Finally, he sighed and reached beneath the counter, pulling out a thin folder of yellowed newspaper clippings he had clearly kept hidden from casual view for a long time. Your family has never wanted this discussed, he said quietly, but you're not a child anymore, and perhaps it's time someone in the Hartwell family finally understood. The clippings, dated more than 40 years earlier, told a story in fragments, the way old newspapers often do, more concerned with drama than clarity. A fire, apparently, had broken out one autumn evening on the Hartwell land, near an older structure that had stood on the same site as the current tower. A young man had died in the blaze. The articles hinted, in careful, evasive language, that a member of the Whitfield family, relatives of the Hartwells by marriage, had been present at the time, and that questions had been raised, though nothing had ever been formally proven. The name that appeared most often in the clippings was Cora Whitfield. She would have been young then, Walter said, barely into her 20s. The fire took the life of her sister's fiancé, a man everyone in town had liked well enough. There was no trial, no formal charge, but the whispers were enough. People in Ashford Hollow can be forgiving of many things, Miss Hartwell, but they rarely forget. What happened to her? Alira asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer. Officially, she left town not long after. Moved away, some said, to live with distant relatives. Nobody ever saw her again. The old structure on the property burned down entirely, and a new tower was built on the same foundation not long after, sealed up tight, if the stories are to be believed, by her own grieving family, who could no longer bear the shame the town had heaped upon them. Alira sat very still, the pieces settling into place with a weight that made her chest ache. You think she never actually left? Walter did not answer directly, but the careful way he avoided her eyes told her enough. There are stories, he admitted eventually. Old stories, the kind nobody takes seriously anymore. That the tower wasn't built to replace what burned, but to hide it, to hide her. That her family, unable to face what the town would do to her if she stayed visible, built her a place to disappear into, instead of forcing her to leave everything and everyone she had ever known. For 40 years? Alira's voice came out barely above a whisper. I don't know if it's true, Walter said gently. I only know that no one has ever seen her leave that tower, and no one has ever found record of her arriving anywhere else. Alira walked home that evening in a daze, the newspaper clippings folded carefully inside her coat pocket. The pieces of her strange, quiet correspondence suddenly felt entirely different. She was not writing letters into empty air, hoping some unseen presence might read them out of simple curiosity. She was writing to a woman who had spent 4 decades sealed away from the entire world, carrying a grief and a shame so heavy that hiding had once seemed like the only bearable option. That night, she wrote a letter unlike any she had written before. She did not ask about the fire, or the fiancé, or anything the newspapers had hinted at. She simply wrote, as gently as she knew how, that she did not care what the old stories said, that she was not there to judge, only to keep writing, if that was something the person behind the stone still wanted. She carried the letter out beneath a sky thick with clouds, kneeling at the familiar crack in the stone, with hands that trembled slightly, not from cold this time, but from the enormity of what she now understood she might be doing. She pushed the letter through and waited, though she was not entirely sure what she expected to happen. Nothing happened immediately. No sound came from within the tower, no answering movement in the darkness beyond the stone. Alira knelt there a long while, the cold seeping slowly into her knees, before finally standing and making her way back across the field. Days passed without any new object appearing at the ledge. Alira told herself this was to be expected, that she had crossed some invisible line by acknowledging what she now knew, that perhaps the fragile trust she had been building without realizing it had been damaged by moving too quickly. She almost stopped visiting altogether. The thought crossed her mind more than once, particularly on the mornings when Uncle Victor's frustration over the land sale reached new heights, when the weight of settling her mother's affairs left little room for anything else. It would have been easier, in many ways, to let the tower remain what it had always been to the rest of Ashford Hollow, an old structure best left alone, its secrets buried along with everyone who might have once cared to uncover them. But then, nearly 2 weeks after she had sent that letter, she returned to the tower one quiet evening, and found something waiting for her that changed everything again. It was not an object this time, not a stone or a flower, or a scrap of old fabric. It was a piece of paper, folded the same careful way she folded her own letters, tucked just inside the crack where she could not have missed it. Her hands shook as she pulled it free and unfolded it beneath the fading evening light. The handwriting was old-fashioned, careful, each letter formed with the kind of deliberate patience that belonged to another era entirely. It was short. It did not explain everything, or even most things, but it was, without question, a reply. It read simply, "Thank you for not asking me to leave." Alira stood there in the darkening field for a long time, the letter held gently in both hands, feeling something inside her chest shift in a way she could not fully name. For 10 years to come, though she did not yet know it that evening, this would become the foundation of everything that followed. A woman writing letters to a stranger, sealed behind stone walls, and a stranger, after 40 years of silence, finally choosing to write back. That single line of ink changed the shape of Alira's days. What had once been a quiet, private ritual of grief slowly became something else entirely, something she found herself protecting fiercely, even from the people closest to her. She began writing every few days, instead of once a week, and though the replies from behind the stone came slowly, sometimes with a week or two of silence between them, they always came eventually, each one a little longer than the last, each one revealing a small piece of a life that had been hidden from the world for far longer than Alira had been alive. Cora Whitfield, as Alira now knew her to be, wrote carefully, almost formally at first, as though she had not practiced ordinary conversation in so long that the shape of it felt unfamiliar in her hands. She wrote about small things to begin with, mirroring the way Alira had once written about her mother's garden. She described the sound of rain against the tower's stone roof, the particular way morning light moved across the far wall of her small, hidden room at certain times of year, the birds that nested just beyond her boarded window, and how she had learned, over the decades, to recognize each one by the pattern of its song. She did not speak of the fire, not for many months. Alira never pushed, understanding instinctively that some doors could only be opened from the inside, no matter how gently someone knocked from without. Instead, their correspondence built itself slowly into something resembling a friendship, strange as that word felt applied to two people who had never once seen each other's faces. Alira told Cora about her work at the small accounting office in town, about Nora's endless attempts to convince her to try new recipes, about the particular stubbornness of Uncle Victor, who continued pushing for the land sale with a persistence that showed no signs of softening. "He wants to tear the tower down," Alira wrote one evening, her pen hesitating slightly over the page. "He says it's worthless. I haven't told him otherwise. I don't know how I could explain any of this without it sounding like madness." The reply that came, nearly 10 days later, was the longest Cora had written yet. "I have heard him sometimes, when the wind carries voices strangely across the field. I understand his frustration better than you might think. This tower has stood empty and useless to the world for 40 years. I do not blame him for wanting to be rid of it. What I could never explain to him, or to anyone, is that emptiness and uselessness are not always the same thing. Sometimes a thing that looks empty from the outside is simply full of something the world was never meant to see. Alira read that letter 3 times before folding it carefully and placing it with the others, which had grown into a small, precious collection, kept in a wooden box that had once belonged to her mother. Autumn passed into winter, and Alira continued making her way to the tower even when snow blanketed the field, and the cold bit sharply at her fingers as she knelt to leave each new letter. Daniel Marsh, who had slowly become a steady presence in her life, once offered to walk with her on one particularly bitter evening, and though she gently declined, telling him only that this was something she needed to do alone, something in his expression told her he understood there was more to the walks than simple habit, and that he respected the boundary without needing it fully explained. It was during that winter that Cora finally began to speak of the fire. She wrote of it slowly, in fragments spread across several letters, as though the memory itself had to be approached carefully, from a safe distance, before it could be looked at directly. She wrote of her younger sister Margot, and of the man Margot had once been engaged to marry, a kind, quiet man named Edwin Foss who had worked the neighboring farm and who had, by every account Cora offered, been well loved by nearly everyone who knew him. She wrote of an evening gathering at the old structure that had once stood where the tower now stood, a smaller building used for storing grain and old farm equipment, lit that night by lanterns for a small celebration ahead of the coming wedding. She wrote of laughter, of music from a borrowed fiddle, of an accident involving an overturned lantern that no one, not even Cora herself in the years since, had ever been able to fully explain or reconstruct with certainty. I have spent 40 years trying to remember exactly what happened, Cora wrote, her handwriting slightly less steady than in her earlier letters. I remember reaching for something. I remember heat, faster and larger than anything I had ever imagined fire could become in so short a time. I remember screaming, though I could never afterward say clearly whether it was my own voice or someone else's. Edwin did not make it out. I did. And in a town as small as ours, where every story travels faster than truth ever can, that was enough for people to decide, without ever saying it plainly to my face, that I must have been the reason he did not. Alira sat with that letter for a long time before she found the words to respond. When she finally did, she did not offer reassurance or excuse, understanding that Cora had likely heard every possible version of both, offered and withheld, over the course of 4 decades of silence. She wrote instead, I believe you have carried something for far longer than any person should have to carry alone. I am glad you are no longer carrying it in silence, even if all I can offer is a piece of paper pushed through a crack in the stone. The reply that came was shorter than most, but it stayed with Alira longer than almost any letter that came before or after. It is enough, Cora wrote. It is more than I ever expected the world to offer me again. As winter gave way to the first thaw of spring, Alira found herself facing a new kind of pressure from Uncle Victor, who had grown tired of waiting for her cooperation, and had begun speaking with the development company directly, using his position within the family to push the sale forward, despite Alira's continued objections. Family meetings grew tense. Voices were raised more than once across the same kitchen table where her mother had once poured tea on quiet Sunday mornings. You can't keep clinging to sentiment forever, Victor told her one evening, his frustration finally boiling over into something sharper than his usual irritation. That tower has never done a single useful thing in its entire existence. Your mother felt the same sentimental attachment, and look where that got this family, holding on to land we can't afford to simply admire from a distance. Alira wanted, more than anything in that moment, to tell him the truth. To tell him that the tower was not empty, had never been empty, that a woman had lived quietly behind those stones for 40 years, carrying a grief the whole town had helped create, and had then conveniently chosen to forget. But she held her tongue, understanding that revealing Cora's secret without her permission would be its own kind of betrayal, one she was not willing to commit no matter how much pressure Victor applied. Instead, she began quietly building a case of her own. She returned to Walter Finch at the library more than once, gathering what fragments of historical record still existed, learning that the land technically fell under a protected designation due to its age and its connection to some of the earliest structures in Ashford Hollow's founding, a fact that might, if pursued correctly, at least delay any immediate demolition. She said nothing of this to Cora directly, unwilling to raise hope over something that remained uncertain. But she wrote, in careful, steady words, a simple promise she intended to keep. I don't know everything that will happen with this land, she wrote one evening in early spring, the first green shoots pushing up through the softened earth around the tower's base. But I want you to know that as long as I have any say in the matter, no one is tearing this tower down. Not while you are still inside it. The reply that came was brief, but Alira would carry the weight of it for years afterward, through everything that followed. Then perhaps, Cora wrote, I have finally found someone worth staying for. 2 years slipped by with a quiet steadiness that surprised Alira more than she expected. Life, she had learned, does not pause simply because a person carries a secret as large as the one folded into her weekly walks across the field. She continued her work at the accounting office, continued her long conversations with Nora over lukewarm tea, and continued, slowly and without quite noticing when it happened, falling in love with Daniel Marsh. He proposed to her in early summer, beneath the same old oak tree where her mother used to sit with her morning coffee, and Alira said yes, before he had even finished the question. Their wedding was small, held in the garden behind the Hartwell house, with Nora standing beside her, and Walter Finch offering a surprisingly moving toast about the importance of holding on to the things worth keeping, even when the rest of the world insists on letting go. Alira did not tell Daniel about Cora until nearly a year into their marriage. She had wrestled with the decision for months, unsure whether revealing the secret would be a betrayal of the fragile trust she had built with the woman behind the stone, or whether continuing to hide something so significant from her husband was its own kind of dishonesty. In the end, it was Daniel himself who made the decision easier, noticing, the way Nora once had, the particular look Alira carried whenever she returned from her evening walks. You don't have to tell me everything, he said gently one night, sitting across from her at their small kitchen table. But I'd like to understand, if you're willing to let me. So she told him, all of it, from the very first letter pushed through the crack in grief-stricken desperation, to the pressed flower that had changed everything, to the long, careful unfolding of Cora Whitfield's story across 2 years of correspondence. Daniel listened without interrupting, his expression shifting slowly from surprise to something gentler, something that looked almost like reverence by the time she finished. 40 years, he said quietly, when she had finished. She's been in there for 40 years, and no one else knows. A few people suspect, Alira said. Walter Finch, I think, has always known more than he said, but no one has confirmed it. No one has seen her. Only me, and only through paper and stone. Daniel reached across the table and took her hand. Then I suppose I understand now why you fight your uncle so hard over that land. Their daughter, whom they named Millie, was born the following spring, arriving on a bright morning in April, with a full head of dark hair, and a cry loud enough to wake the entire street, according to Nora, who had been in the next room the whole time. Motherhood reshaped Alira's days in ways both exhausting and quietly joyful, and yet even in the haze of sleepless nights and endless small demands, she never stopped her visits to the tower. She simply adjusted them, carrying Millie bundled against her chest on cool evenings, murmuring softly to her daughter about the strange, patient friendship growing behind ancient stone walls, though Millie was far too young to understand any of it. Cora, in her letters, began asking gently about the baby, her handwriting occasionally growing shaky in ways that worried Alira more than she let herself admit. She described, in delicate, careful language, the particular ache of imagining a child she would never be permitted to see, not directly, not with her own eyes, only through the second-hand wonder of Alira's descriptions. Tell me what her laugh sounds like, Cora wrote once. I have not heard a child's laughter in so long I fear I have nearly forgotten the sound of it. Alira did her best in her replies, describing the particular delighted shriek Millie gave whenever the family dog chased its own tail across the garden, the way her small fingers curled instinctively around anything placed near them, the stubborn, determined set of her jaw that Daniel insisted she had inherited directly from her mother. Meanwhile, Uncle Victor's campaign to sell the land had not softened with time. If anything, the arrival of Millie seemed to embolden him further, as he began framing his arguments around the child's future rather than his own convenience, insisting that the money from a sale to the development company, could secure a far better life for the newest generation of Hartwells than a crumbling, useless old tower ever could. "You have a daughter now," he told Elira one autumn afternoon, standing in the kitchen with the particular stubborn set to his shoulders that meant he had rehearsed this conversation beforehand. "Surely that changes things. Surely you can see past sentiment now, for her sake if not your own." "It's precisely because I have a daughter that I won't let that tower be torn down," Elira replied, her voice steadier than she expected it to be. "There's more history in that stone than you understand, Uncle Victor. More than I can explain to you right now. But I promise you, the day will come when you understand why I've fought so hard to protect it." Victor did not press further that day, though the tension between them lingered, unspoken but present, at every family gathering that followed. Elira knew, even as she deflected his questions, that the day of reckoning could not be postponed indefinitely. The development company remained interested. The land remained valuable, and somewhere beneath all of it, a woman continued living in near total isolation, her existence held together by little more than folded paper and the quiet devotion of a woman who had once needed somewhere to put her grief, and had found, instead, someone else's grief, waiting to meet her halfway. That winter, the letters from behind the stone grew noticeably shorter, the handwriting increasingly uneven. Elira told herself it was simply the cold, that Cora's hands, like anyone's, grew stiffer in the winter months, that there was no need yet to worry beyond the ordinary concern any friend might feel for another. But one evening in late January, kneeling at the familiar crack in the stone with snow falling softly around her, Elira found a letter waiting that struck her differently than any that had come before. "I do not know how many winters I have left in me," Cora had written, her handwriting careful but visibly strained. "I have made my peace with much in this life, more than I ever expected to. But I confess there is one thing I still long for, foolish as it may sound after everything I have built these stone walls to avoid. I would like, before the end comes, whenever that may be, to feel the sun on my face one more time. Not through a boarded window, not through a crack in old stone. Just once, beneath open sky." Elira knelt there in the falling snow for a long time after reading those words, her breath clouding in the cold air, her heart aching with a fierce, sudden determination that would carry her through everything still to come. "You will," she whispered to the silent stone, though she had no way yet of knowing how she would keep such a promise. "I don't know how yet, but I promise you, you will." The promise Elira made in the snow that January evening followed her through the months that came after, settling into her chest like a stone of her own, heavy and constant. She did not know how to keep it. She only knew that she intended to, whatever it eventually required. She began, quietly and carefully, researching what it might take to safely open a structure that had stood sealed for 4 decades. She spoke first with Owen Blake, a builder from a neighboring town, known for his careful, respectful work restoring old properties rather than simply demolishing them for something newer. She did not tell him the full truth at first, only that she was considering the possibility of restoring the tower, rather than allowing it to be sold or torn down, and that she wanted to understand what such a restoration might involve. Owen's assessment, delivered after a careful walk around the tower's exterior, was not encouraging. Structures like this, sealed up and left untouched for so long, tend to develop problems you can't see from the outside, he explained, running a weathered hand along one of the lower stones. Moisture gets trapped. Foundations shift without anyone noticing. It's not impossible to open something like this safely, but it needs to be done carefully, by people who know what they're doing, and even then, there's real risk involved. Elira absorbed this information with a growing unease she did not share with Cora in her letters, unwilling to introduce fear into a friendship that had already carried so much of it over the years. Instead, she continued writing as she always had, describing Millie's growing vocabulary, the particular way Daniel hummed off-key while cooking dinner. Small, ordinary joys that she hoped might offer some comfort against the uncertain future, both of them now quietly carried. Cora's letters, meanwhile, continued growing shorter through the spring, though never entirely silent. She wrote once of a persistent cough that had settled into her chest sometime in February and had not fully cleared even as the weather warmed. She wrote of dizziness some mornings, of needing to sit for longer stretches before she could manage her small daily tasks. She never complained outright, framing each admission carefully, almost apologetically, as though she feared burdening Alira with concerns that were, in her own words, simply the ordinary business of growing old. "I have lived far longer in this tower than I ever expected to," she wrote one gray morning in early spring. "I do not say this to frighten you, only to be honest, as I have tried to be with you since that very first letter you left. Whatever time remains to me, I am grateful to have spent it, in whatever small way, in your company." Alira read that letter standing in the field with tears freezing slightly on her cheeks in the lingering cold, and she made a decision that morning that she had been circling for months without quite allowing herself to fully commit to. It was time to tell Uncle Victor the truth. She approached him carefully, choosing a quiet evening when Millie had already gone to sleep and Daniel had discreetly excused himself to give them privacy. She laid out everything, from the first letter written in grief to the years of careful correspondence that followed, watching her uncle's stern, skeptical expression shift slowly through disbelief, confusion, and finally something that looked almost like shame. "You're telling me Cora Whitfield has been alive this entire time," he said slowly, setting down the drink he had been holding without taking a sip. "That she's been in there, in that tower, for 40 years, and no one in this family ever knew, or asked, or wondered enough to find out." "Some people suspected," Alira said gently, "but no one confirmed it. No one wanted to disturb whatever peace the family thought they were protecting by leaving it alone." Victor was quiet for a long time, staring at the dark window as though he could somehow see all the way across the field to the tower itself. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried none of its usual sharp certainty. "My mother used to visit that tower sometimes, when I was young," he said slowly, as though the memory were only now resurfacing after decades buried beneath other, louder concerns. "I never understood why. I thought perhaps she simply admired the old architecture. I never once considered that someone might actually be living inside it." "She was your aunt by marriage," Alira said softly. "Cora Whitfield, Margot's older sister. I don't know all the details of how the family arrangement came to be, only that somehow, over the years, the truth simply stopped being spoken of, until it became easier to forget than to remember." Victor sat with this revelation for a long while, and when he finally spoke again, the stubborn insistence on selling the land that had defined so many of their conversations over the past few years was, for the first time, entirely absent from his voice. "We can't sell that land," he said quietly. "Not now, not knowing this." It was, Alira would later reflect, one of the strangest and most significant conversations of her entire life, watching decades of stubborn family tension dissolve in the space of a single evening, replaced by something far more complicated, the shared, sobering weight of a truth too large for any of them to fully process all at once. Together, in the weeks that followed, Alira and Victor began quietly assembling what they would need to eventually open the tower safely, without alerting the rest of the town, without risking the kind of attention that might bring unwanted questions before they were ready to answer them. Owen Blake returned for a more thorough structural assessment, this time with the full truth explained to him under strict confidence, and his concern only deepened once he understood the stakes involved. "If there really is someone living inside," he said carefully, standing at the base of the tower with Alira and Victor on a cool spring afternoon, "then we need to be even more careful than I first thought. An untrained attempt to break through these walls could be genuinely dangerous, both to whoever's inside and to anyone attempting it." Alira nodded, understanding the weight of his words, even as urgency continued building inside her chest with every letter that arrived thinner and shorter than the one before it. She wrote to Cora that evening, choosing her words with careful precision, unwilling to make promises she was not certain she could keep, but equally unwilling to continue letting silence stand in for hope. "There are people now who know about you," she wrote. "People who want to help, carefully and safely, when the time is right. I know this may frighten you, after so many years of hiding, but I need you to trust me a little further, the way you've trusted me since that very first flower you left for me. We are going to find a way to bring you into the light, Cora. I promise you that." The reply, when it came nearly 2 weeks later, was shorter than most, the handwriting visibly weaker than in earlier letters, but the words themselves carried a steadiness that eased some of the fear sitting heavy in Alira's chest. "I have spent 40 years believing the world would never forgive me for something I have never fully understood myself. If you tell me it is finally time to find out whether that fear was ever true, then I will trust you, as I have trusted you with everything else." I only ask that whatever comes, it comes gently. Elira folded that letter with hands that trembled slightly, understanding that whatever came next, whatever difficult, uncertain path lay ahead of them, there was no turning back now. The quiet, private world she and Cora had built together, across a decade's worth of paper and stone, was about to collide, finally and irreversibly, with the wider world both of them had spent years carefully holding at arm's length. Despite the resolve Elira carried in her heart, the practical reality of what lay ahead proved far more complicated than she had allowed herself to imagine. Owen Blake's careful assessments, repeated over several visits through the early summer, revealed problems that grew more concerning with each new inspection. The tower's foundation, hidden for decades beneath undisturbed soil and creeping ivy, showed signs of significant erosion. Water damage had weakened certain sections of the interior structure, in ways that could not be fully understood without opening walls that had not seen daylight in 40 years. "I won't lie to you," Owen said one afternoon, standing with Elira and Victor beneath a sky, heavy with the promise of summer storms. "Every week we wait, the risk only grows, but rushing this could be just as dangerous as waiting too long. We need proper engineers, proper equipment, and a plan that accounts for the fact that someone may be inside those walls when we begin." The cost of doing things properly, safely, carefully, proved far higher than any of them had anticipated. Victor, in an unexpected reversal that still surprised Elira weeks later, offered to use a significant portion of his own savings toward the effort, a decision he explained simply as owing something, finally, to an aunt the family had spent decades pretending did not exist. But even with funding secured, bureaucratic obstacles emerged that neither Elira nor Victor had fully anticipated. The tower's protected historical designation, which Elira had once hoped might save it from demolition, now created new complications of its own, requiring permits and inspections from county offices, unaccustomed to handling a situation quite so unusual. Weeks stretched into months as paperwork moved slowly through channels never designed for circumstances like theirs. Through it all, Elira continued writing, continued receiving replies that grew increasingly sparse and increasingly difficult to read, both in handwriting and in the weight of what remained carefully unsaid between the lines. There were days, more than she liked to admit even to herself, when exhaustion nearly overwhelmed her resolve entirely. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," she confessed to Daniel one night, sitting at their kitchen table long after Millie had gone to sleep, papers and permit applications scattered across the surface between them. "Every week feels like another delay we can't afford. Every letter feels shorter than the last. What if we're too slow? What if all of this effort simply comes too late?" Daniel reached across the table and took her hand, the same gesture he had offered on the night she first told him the truth about Cora. "You've already given her something no one else in this town managed to give her in 40 years, he said gently. "You gave her someone who listened. Whatever happens next, that matters more than you're giving yourself credit for right now." His words offered some comfort, though the fear did not fully leave her. Not through the long summer of permits and inspections, not through the careful, painstaking process of assembling a team Owen trusted enough to handle such delicate, uncertain work. It was during this difficult stretch, when doubt pressed most heavily against her resolve, that Elira received the letter that would stay with her for the rest of her life. The handwriting, when she first unfolded the page, was barely legible, each letter shaped with visible effort, as though the simple act of holding a pen had become a struggle Cora was determined to overcome regardless of the cost. "I do not know how much longer my hands will manage this," the letter began, and Elira felt her chest tighten painfully even before reading further. "But I wanted you to have something, in case time moves faster than your careful plans allow." Folded inside the letter, wrapped in a small scrap of faded blue fabric, was a delicate silver locket, tarnished with age but clearly once treasured. Elira opened it carefully, her hands trembling, and found inside a small, faded photograph of two young women standing arm in arm, before what appeared to be the very structure that had once stood where the tower now stood, laughing at something outside the frame of the image, their faces bright with a joy that predated whatever tragedy would later reshape both their lives entirely. "This was my sister Margot and myself," the letter continued, the handwriting growing shakier toward the end. "I have kept this locket close to me every single day for 40 years, the only piece of the world before the fire that I allowed myself to keep. I want you to have it now, not because I have given up hope of meeting you properly, but because I want you to understand fully what it is you have been fighting to save, in case my own strength fails before your plans can succeed. I was young once, Illyra. I laughed. I loved. I want you to know that version of me existed too, before everything else that came after buried her so deeply I nearly forgot her myself. Illyra sat with that letter and locket for a long time that evening, tears falling freely down her face, understanding with sudden, overwhelming clarity exactly how much weight rested on the fragile, uncertain timeline Owen and his team were still working to finalize. She carried the locket with her every day after that, a physical reminder of the promise she had made in the snow that January evening, the promise she intended to keep no matter what obstacles continued standing in her way. It was Nora, ever practical, ever willing to push where gentleness alone had not been enough, who finally suggested the idea that broke through the last of the bureaucratic delay holding their plans in place. "You've been trying to handle this quietly," Nora said one afternoon, sitting across from Illyra in the small kitchen that had once belonged to Illyra's mother. "Maybe quiet isn't working anymore. Maybe it's time the whole town understood what's actually at stake here. Not just for Cora's sake, but for the sake of moving these permits faster than county offices seem willing to move them on their own." Illyra resisted the idea at first, protective of the privacy she and Cora had guarded so carefully for years. But as another month passed with painfully little progress, she began to understand that Nora was right. The careful secrecy that had once protected Cora from the town's judgment had, over time, become its own kind of obstacle, one that could no longer serve the urgent needs of the present moment. With Cora's reluctant but genuine blessing, communicated through a letter that took considerable courage to write, Illyra finally made the decision that would change everything that followed. She would tell the truth, publicly, to the entire town of Ashford Hollow, about the woman who had spent 40 years living in complete isolation, just beyond the edge of everyone's ordinary daily lives. It was a decision that terrified her more than almost anything she had faced since her mother's funeral. But it was also, she understood with growing certainty, the only path left that might finally bring Cora Whitfield safely, gently, and in time, back into the light she had been quietly longing for all these many years. The town hall in Ashford Hollow had not seen a crowd so large in years, not since the annual Harvest Festival drew visitors from neighboring towns each autumn. Word had spread quickly in the days following Illyra's request for a public meeting, whispered from porch to porch, shop counter to shop counter, the particular kind of curiosity that only a genuine mystery can stir in a place where very little ever changes. Illyra stood at the front of the room that evening, with Daniel beside her, Millie asleep against Nora's shoulder in the back row, Victor seated in the front with an expression that mixed nervousness and quiet determination in equal measure. Walter Finch had offered to bring what historical records he could gather, prepared to support whatever explanation Illyra chose to give. She had rehearsed her words for days, and yet standing before the assembled faces of nearly the entire town, all that careful preparation seemed to evaporate the moment she opened her mouth to speak. 40 years ago, she began, her voice steadier than she expected, once the first words finally came. A fire broke out on my family's land. A young man named Edwin Foss lost his life that night, and a young woman named Cora Whitfield lost nearly everything else, her reputation, her place in this town, and, as I have come to learn over the past 10 years, very nearly her entire life. A murmur moved through the crowd, old memories stirring behind older faces, though most of the younger residents of Ashford Hollow had never heard the name spoken aloud before. "What most of you don't know," Illyra continued, forcing herself to meet the eyes scattered throughout the room rather than looking away, "is that Cora Whitfield never actually left Ashford Hollow at all. She has been alive this entire time, living in complete isolation inside the tower on our family's land, hidden away by a family, and by extension a town, that made her feel there was no other choice available to her." The silence that followed was heavier than any noise could have been. Illyra told them everything then, or nearly everything, careful only to omit the most private, personal details of the letters themselves, which felt too intimate, too precious, to share with a room full of strangers, however well-intentioned her reasons for finally speaking. She told them about the first letter written in grief, about the pressed flower that started everything, about 10 years of correspondence that had slowly, carefully, rebuilt a bridge between one isolated woman and the world that had once turned so completely against her. "I am asking for your help," Elira said finally, her voice thick with an emotion she no longer tried to hide. "Not your judgment. Cora has carried enough of that already, for far longer than any person should have to. I am asking for patience, for support, and if any of you are able, for whatever influence you might have to help move the permits we need to open that tower safely, before it's too late." The reaction, when it finally came, was not what Elira had feared most. There was no outrage, no repeated condemnation of a woman most of the room had never actually known personally. Instead, there was something closer to grief, an entire town slowly reckoning with the quiet cruelty of collective forgetting, the way a single tragedy, left unexamined for 4 decades, had quietly destroyed a life, while everyone else simply moved forward, comfortable in their decision, never to ask too many questions. An elderly woman near the back of the room, whom Elira recognized as Agnes Miller, one of the oldest remaining residents of Ashford Hollow, rose slowly to her feet, leaning heavily on a cane. "I remember that night," Agnes said, her voice trembling slightly with age but carrying clearly through the silent room. "I remember Cora Whitfield before all of it happened. She used to sing in the church choir, had the sweetest voice you ever heard. I always wondered what became of her, after everyone stopped speaking her name. I think, in my heart, some part of me always suspected the truth was more complicated than the story we all told ourselves." Other voices followed, some offering memories, others offering simple, quiet apologies for a judgment they had never personally issued, but had nonetheless allowed to stand unchallenged for decades. By the end of the evening, something had shifted in the room that Elira had not fully dared to hope for. The county permit office representative present that evening, moved visibly by the story unfolding before him, promised to expedite the remaining paperwork as quickly as legally possible. In the weeks that followed, the entire dynamic of the effort to open the tower changed dramatically. What had once been a slow, private struggle, carried almost entirely by Elira, Victor, and a small handful of trusted allies became, almost overnight, a shared community effort. Volunteers offered their time and skills, local businesses donated supplies. Owen Blake found himself with more support than he had ever anticipated needing, engineers and specialists from neighboring towns offering their expertise. Once word of the unusual situation reached them through local news coverage that spread further than anyone in Ashford Hollow had expected. Through all of this sudden, overwhelming change, Elira continued her letters to Cora, careful to prepare her gently for the growing attention now surrounding what had once been the most private secret either of them had ever kept. "The town knows now," Elira wrote one evening, choosing her words as carefully as she knew how. "I would never have told them without your permission, and I want you to know that the response has not been what either of us might have feared. There is more compassion here than the town ever managed to show you 40 years ago. I believe, when the day finally comes, you will find a very different Ashford Hollow waiting for you than the one you remember." The reply, when it came, was shorter than Elira would have liked, the handwriting weaker still, but the words themselves carried a fragile note of something that felt, for the first time in a long while, almost like hope. "I have been afraid of this moment for 40 years, Cora wrote. "I do not know if I am ready for it, even now. But I trust you, Elira, more than I have trusted anyone in longer than I can properly remember. If you tell me the world outside has softened, even a little, then perhaps it is finally time to find out for myself." As the permits finally cleared and Owen's team began the careful, painstaking work of assessing exactly how to open the tower's stone walls without causing further structural collapse, Elira felt the weight of 10 years settling into a single, approaching moment. Every letter, every pressed flower, every small object passed carefully between two lives, kept apart by stone and circumstance, had led inevitably toward this, the day the sealed tower would finally, after 4 long decades, be opened to the world once more. The morning Owen Blake's team finally began work on the tower arrived cool and clear, the kind of early autumn day that carried both crispness and a gentle warmth in the sunlight breaking over the field. Elira had barely slept the night before, lying awake beside Daniel with her thoughts circling endlessly around everything that could go right and everything that could go wrong. A small crowd had gathered at a respectful distance, kept back by a rope barrier Owen had insisted upon for safety, though Elira suspected the barrier served an emotional purpose as much as a practical one. This was, after all, not simply a construction project. It was the culmination of 10 years of letters, of a secret, carefully kept and finally shared, of an entire town, slowly learning to reckon with a truth it had spent 4 decades avoiding. Nora stood beside Elira, with Millie held firmly by the hand, the little girl watching the proceedings with wide, curious eyes, too young to fully understand the significance of the moment, but old enough to sense the weight of anticipation, carried by every adult around her. Victor stood nearby, uncharacteristically quiet, his eyes fixed on the tower with an expression Elira had rarely seen on her uncle's face before, something close to reverence. Owen's team worked carefully, methodically, beginning not with the sealed entrance they had identified through careful study of the old records Walter Finch had uncovered, but with smaller structural assessments, meant to ensure the surrounding stone would not collapse the moment pressure was applied. Every hour that passed felt impossibly long to Elira, though she understood, watching the careful, deliberate movements of the workers, that rushing now would serve no one, least of all the woman waiting patiently behind those ancient walls. It was nearly midday when Owen finally approached Elira, his expression carrying the particular calm of a man who had assessed every risk he could think of, and had concluded, at last, that the moment had come. "We're ready," he said simply. "The entrance point looks structurally sound enough to open safely. I won't lie to you, there's still risk involved, but I don't believe waiting any longer will reduce that risk. If you want to proceed, we can begin now." Elira looked toward the tower, its gray stones catching the midday light in a way she had never quite noticed before. Despite 10 years of visits at dusk and dawn, she thought of the first letter she had pushed through that narrow crack in grief, never imagining it might lead to this moment. She thought of the pressed flower, the smooth river stone, the tarnished silver locket now resting carefully in a small velvet pouch tucked into her coat pocket, ready to be returned to the woman who had trusted her with it. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "Please, let's bring her home." The work of actually opening the sealed entrance took nearly 3 more hours, each minute stretching with unbearable tension, as Owen's team carefully removed stone by stone from the section identified as the tower's original, long-forgotten door. Elira stood as close as the safety barrier allowed, Daniel's arm wrapped firmly around her shoulders, Nora holding Millie a little further back, the little girl growing increasingly restless with the long, quiet waiting that adults seemed to find so significant. When the final stone finally shifted loose, revealing a narrow, dark opening leading into the tower's hollow interior, a hush fell over the entire gathered crowd. Owen turned toward Elira, his expression careful, measured. "The opening is stable," he confirmed after a brief inspection with a portable light. "It's safe to enter. Would you like to be the one to go first?" Elira nodded, unable to trust her voice in that moment, and stepped forward toward the narrow gap in the stone that had, for 40 years, separated one woman entirely from the rest of the world. The air inside the tower was cool and still, carrying the particular scent of old stone, dust, and something faintly floral that Elira could not immediately place. She moved carefully through the narrow entrance, guided by the beam of a flashlight Owen had pressed into her hand, her eyes slowly adjusting to the dim, filtered light that fell through gaps near the tower's boarded upper windows. The space inside was smaller than she had imagined, and yet it carried an unmistakable sense of a life carefully, deliberately maintained, despite decades of isolation. A narrow bed sat against one curved wall, neatly made. A small table nearby held a modest collection of books, their spines worn soft with age and repeated reading. And on a shelf built into the stone itself, Elira saw with a sudden, overwhelming rush of emotion, a small wooden box filled with folded papers, every single letter she had ever written, kept carefully, preserved with obvious reverence across 10 full years. But it was the figure seated in a worn chair near the room's center that finally stopped Elira's breath entirely. Cora Whitfield was smaller than Elira had ever imagined her, frail in the way only decades of hidden confinement could produce, her hair entirely silver, her hands folded carefully in her lap. But her eyes, when they lifted to meet Elira's for the very first time, carried an unmistakable clarity, a sharpness undimmed by 40 years of solitude, a spark of recognition and quiet, overwhelming relief that needed no words to fully convey. "Elira," Cora said softly, her voice thin but steady, shaped by a woman who had clearly practiced saying that name many times in the silent privacy of her own thoughts. I always wondered what you might look like. Alira crossed the small room slowly, kneeling before the chair, tears already falling freely down her face, as she reached out and gently took both of Cora's frail, trembling hands into her own. I promised you the sun, Alira whispered. I'm here to keep that promise. The moment Cora Whitfield stepped, or rather was carefully carried, beyond the threshold of the tower she had not left in 40 years, the entire crowd gathered at a respectful distance, fell into a silence so complete that even the birds in the nearby trees seemed to pause their calling. Owen had insisted on a wheelchair for the initial transition, unwilling to risk Cora's frail health after so many years of limited movement, and Alira walked beside it slowly, one hand resting gently on Cora's shoulder, as the small procession made its way out into the wide, open field, beneath a sky so vast and blue it seemed almost unbelievable after the narrow, filtered light Cora had known for 4 decades. When the wheelchair finally stopped in the center of the open field, Cora lifted her face slowly toward the sun, closing her eyes, and for a long moment she simply sat there, motionless, as though absorbing something she had feared she might never experience again. Tears slipped freely down her weathered cheeks, though her expression carried nothing of sorrow in that moment, only a deep, overwhelming relief that seemed to reach all the way down to something long buried, and finally, gently, unearthed. I had forgotten, Cora whispered eventually, her voice trembling with emotion. How warm it feels. I had forgotten so many things, living in that stillness for so long, but not this. I don't think I ever truly forgot this. Agnes Miller, the elderly woman who had spoken so movingly at the town meeting weeks earlier, approached slowly from the edge of the crowd, leaning on her cane, tears of her own visible on her weathered face. Cora Whitfield, she said softly, stopping a respectful distance away. Do you remember me? Agnes, we used to sing together in the church choir, more years ago than either of us probably cares to count. Cora studied the elderly woman's face for a long moment, something shifting slowly behind her eyes as recognition dawned. Agnes, she said finally, her voice breaking slightly. You always sang the harmony parts better than anyone else in that choir. I remember. The two women, who had once been girls together before tragedy separated their lives so completely, reached for each other's hands across the years that had passed between them, and something in that simple gesture seemed to unlock a wave of emotion throughout the entire gathered crowd. More people stepped forward, some who remembered Cora from before the fire, others who had only heard fragments of her story over the years, all of them offering quiet words of welcome that Cora received with a mixture of overwhelm and cautious, hesitant gratitude. In the days that followed, Cora was moved to a quiet room in the local medical facility, where doctors carefully assessed the toll 4 decades of isolation and limited movement had taken on her body. The news was not entirely without concern. Her heart, the doctors explained gently, showed signs of significant strain, and her overall health required careful, ongoing management. But there was no immediate danger, they assured Alira, only the natural fragility that comes with age, combined with decades of insufficient sunlight, limited nutrition, and restricted movement. Alira visited every single day, often bringing Millie along, whose initial shyness around the frail, unfamiliar woman quickly gave way to an easy, uncomplicated affection that seemed to bring Cora more joy than almost anything else in those early weeks of reintegration. She has your stubborn chin, Cora told Alira one afternoon, watching Millie carefully stack a small tower of wooden blocks on the floor beside her hospital bed. I could see it in your letters, even before I met either of you properly. Some things simply carry through, generation after generation, whether we intend them to or not. It was during these early weeks that Cora finally shared, in person and at far greater length than any letter had allowed, the full truth of the fire that had shaped the entire remaining course of her life. She spoke of that night carefully, with the particular steadiness of someone who has finally found enough safety to revisit a memory long avoided. I have relived that evening more times than I can count, she told Alira, sitting propped against pillows in the quiet hospital room, sunlight streaming freely through the window beside her bed. For years I believed, the way the whole town seemed to believe, that I must have done something, however small, however unintentional, to cause that fire. It took me decades of solitude, more time than any person should require, to finally understand that an accident, however terrible its consequences, does not automatically become someone's fault simply because the town needs somewhere to place its grief. An investigation, quietly reopened at Alira's request, with the help of county records and a fire safety expert willing to review the original, incomplete reports from 40 years earlier, ultimately confirmed what Cora had come to believe on her own, after so many years of painful reflection. The fire had almost certainly begun with a faulty lantern, its wick improperly trimmed, its base unsteady on the uneven wooden floor of the old storage structure. There had been no negligence on Cora's part, no action or inaction that could reasonably be blamed for the tragedy that followed. It had simply been, as so many terrible things ultimately are, a devastating accident, compounded immeasurably by a town's need to assign blame rather than sit with the discomfort of senseless loss. When the findings were finally made public, delivered gently to Cora by Alira herself in the quiet privacy of the hospital room, Cora sat in silence for a long while, processing 40 years of self-blame slowly beginning to loosen its grip. "I do not know if I can fully release what I have carried for so long," she said eventually, her voice thick with an emotion that seemed to hold both grief and relief in equal measure. "But I think, for the first time in a very long while, I finally believe I might be allowed to try." Alira reached for her hand, the same gesture she had offered in that first moment inside the tower, and held it firmly. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore," she said softly. "You haven't had to for 10 years, even if it took this long for either of us to fully understand what that meant." Spring arrived in Ashford Hollow the following year, with a particular brightness that Alira would later remember as one of the most meaningful seasons of her entire life. Cora Whitfield, though still frail, had grown noticeably stronger over the intervening months, her health steadily improving under careful medical care, regular sunlight, and the slow, patient rebuilding of a life that had been paused for 4 decades. She had chosen, in the end, not to return to live within the tower itself, though she visited it often, walking the familiar field with Alira beside her, sometimes pausing at the very stones where so many letters had once passed quietly between them. Instead, she had settled into a small cottage on the edge of the Hartwell property, close enough to remain part of the family's daily life, far enough to enjoy the particular independence she had, in her own quiet way, come to value even after so many years of enforced solitude. The tower itself underwent careful, respectful restoration over the following months, funded in part by the same community that had once, generations earlier, quietly allowed Cora's isolation to become an accepted, unquestioned fact of local life. Rather than demolishing it, as Victor had once so persistently argued, the town ultimately decided, with Cora's blessing and considerable input, to transform the space into something entirely new, a small local library and community gathering space, dedicated in part to preserving the stories of Ashford Hollow's past, however difficult or uncomfortable those stories might sometimes be. A modest plaque was placed near the tower's newly restored entrance, its words chosen carefully by Alira, Cora, and Walter Finch together, over the course of several thoughtful evenings. "This tower stood sealed for 40 years, it read, holding both a great sorrow and, eventually, an unexpected friendship. May it now stand open, as a reminder that patience, honesty, and compassion can find their way through even the thickest of walls." Uncle Victor, in the months following Cora's emergence, became one of her most devoted and unexpected companions, spending long afternoons at her cottage, listening to stories of a version of Ashford Hollow that had existed long before his own childhood, a version of the town, and of his own family, that he had never fully understood until circumstances forced the truth into the open. The land sale, once the source of so much painful family tension, was never spoken of again. Alira continued writing to Cora, though the letters now traveled a far shorter distance, carried simply across the field between their 2 homes, rather than through a narrow crack in ancient stone. Somehow, despite the ease of simply speaking face-to-face whenever they wished, both women found they still treasured the particular intimacy that letters allowed, the careful, considered honesty that came from putting thoughts to paper, rather than speaking them aloud in the moment. On a warm afternoon in early June, nearly a year after the tower had finally been opened, Alira sat with Cora in the garden behind the cottage, watching Millie chase butterflies through the tall grass, while Daniel worked nearby, repairing a section of fence that had come loose over the winter. 10 years, Cora said quietly, watching the little girl's delighted laughter carry across the warm afternoon air. 10 years of letters, and I never once imagined it might lead to this. A garden, a family, sunlight on my face whenever I wish it. I never imagined it either, Elira admitted, smiling as she watched her daughter finally catch a butterfly gently between cupped hands before releasing it a moment later, delighted simply by the brief, wondrous contact. I only knew, that first night after my mother's funeral, that I needed somewhere to put what I was carrying. I never expected to find someone on the other side who understood that need so completely. Cora reached over and took Elira's hand, the same gesture that had passed between them so many times now, in letters and in person alike. A small, steady connection, built patiently across years of careful, honest correspondence. Grief brought you to that tower, Cora said softly. But it was something far stronger than grief that kept you returning, letter after letter, year after year, long after any reasonable person might have given up on a silence that offered so little in return. I do not know what to call that particular quality in a person, Elira. Perhaps it does not need a name. Perhaps it is simply enough to say that you never gave up on a stranger sealed behind stone, and because of that, an old woman finally remembered what it felt like to be seen again. The two women sat together in comfortable silence for a long while after that, watching the golden afternoon light stretch slowly across the garden, watching a little girl chase butterflies through grass that had once, not so very long ago, led only to a tower sealed shut against the entire world. And somewhere nearby, carried gently on the warm summer breeze, the sound of laughter, real and unguarded, rose freely into open sky, exactly as Cora Whitfield had once dared to hope it someday might.